The room was cold the morning everything changed. Not the temperature, the feeling in the air itself. Something heavy had settled over every desk, every chair, and I could feel it before I even sat down. I found a seat near the back of the conference room and wrapped both hands around a paper coffee cup I never actually drank from. The projector screen at the front of the room was already glowing, and the words on it hit me like a punch I hadn't braced for. Project Failure Analysis, Root Cause. My name sat below that heading, bolded and centered, like a headline in the worst story ever written about me. I read it twice. My eyes weren't playing tricks. Brandon Keller stood at the front, clicking through slides the way someone clicks through vacation photos. Calm, casual, almost warm. His navy suit was pressed perfectly. His voice, when he spoke, was the voice of a man who had absolutely nothing to worry about. Before I continue, we would like you to support our community and help us continue to creating high-quality content. We'd love for you to like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Your engagement helps our videos reach a wider audience and inform our algorithm about the type of content you enjoy. If you'd like to stay up to date on our latest videos and be part of our growing community, please hit the notification bell. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to share more content with you in the future. Ethan signed off on the risk model, he said, letting the pause stretch just long enough. We trusted his expertise. He clicked again. A Slack message filled the screen. My words, pulled from a completely different conversation. This shouldn't be a problem. A VP near the front of the room chuckled softly. Someone behind me whispered. Clearly it was. My chest tightened. That message had nothing to do with the deployment. Brandon had cut it from its original thread, stripped it of all context, and placed it on that screen like evidence at a trial designed for an audience of one. He added, his voice almost gentle, this is what happens when analysts get comfortable. He had rehearsed every word, every beat, every pause, and the entire room was watching me drown while he stood at the front with the clicker in his hand, smiling like a man who had already won. After the meeting ended, I waited for the room to empty. My legs felt stiff, like they had forgotten how to carry me anywhere useful. The hallway outside buzzed with the usual after-meeting noise, keyboards clicking, someone laughing 2 rows over, the elevator chiming at the far end of the floor. All the ordinary sounds of a day that felt anything but ordinary. Brandon appeared at my side and tilted his head toward an empty office nearby. I followed him in. He shut the door behind us without rushing, without any sign of tension in his movements. He wasn't nervous. He had no reason to be. Don't make this bigger than it needs to be, he said. I kept my voice steady. I told him I had recommended a delay, that I had put the recommendation in writing, that the warning was documented and that he had seen it before authorizing the deployment anyway. He leaned back slightly, hands relaxed in his pockets, like we were discussing something minor. Something forgettable. You recommend a delay every time something makes you nervous, he said. Then he stepped just a little closer. Not in any way that would look threatening to a camera. Just close enough for me to feel it. Take the hit, he said quietly. Grow from it, or I will document resistance, and this becomes much harder for you very quickly. There was no shouting, no raised voice, just a quiet, controlled kind of pressure that was somehow more frightening than anger ever could have been. He wasn't reacting emotionally. He had thought every word through in advance. He opened the door and walked out as if the conversation had been pleasant. I stood alone in that office for a moment, the door swinging gently behind him, and I understood for the first time exactly what I was dealing with. 3 weeks before the project collapsed, I had written the email. The subject line was clear: high probability delay risk, recommend postponement. I wasn't guessing and I wasn't being overly cautious. The risk indicators had been building for days, and when I laid everything out, the volatility scores, the unresolved dependencies, the narrow margin for error if anything moved even slightly off plan, the recommendation felt obvious to me. Wait, fix the problem, then launch. Brandon's reply came back the same afternoon. I still remembered the exact words because I had read them many times since. Appreciate your caution. We're moving forward. 11 words. No explanation. No engagement with the specific risks I had raised. Just a polite, immovable wall. In the post-mortem meeting that morning, Brandon had shown that same email exchange to the room, but he had described it differently. He told the leadership team that we had discussed the concerns together and reached a shared agreement on the path forward. He used the word "we" multiple times in 2 sentences. He had taken my documented objection and rebranded it as my endorsement. A warning became a green light. A clearly labeled risk flag became a handshake between colleagues who were fully aligned. The most troubling part was how smoothly it worked. Nobody in that meeting had gone back to read the original thread with careful eyes. They heard Brandon summarize it. They accepted his version without question. Why would they question it? He was the manager. He was the one standing at the front of the room with the slides and the confidence of someone who had already written the ending. Nobody questioned anything. That fact sat in my stomach like a stone that wouldn't move. 3 days before the scheduled launch, I made one final attempt. I sent a formal written request for a delay. Not a Slack message. Not a quick word in the hallway. A documented email with the full risk summary attached, time-stamped, and copied to the project record so it would exist regardless of what happened next. I wanted my position to be unmistakably clear and permanently on file. That afternoon, Brandon removed my approval authority from the deployment system. I found out when I tried to log in and received an access denied message that had not been there the day before. No meeting, no explanation, no conversation, just a quiet administrative action that took less than 2 minutes and changed everything. He deployed the system that evening. The next morning, I arrived early and watched the alerts begin. First one, then a cluster, then the whole dashboard lighting up red like something had caught fire inside the system. By 9 o'clock, the deployment had effectively collapsed under the exact conditions I had flagged in writing. That afternoon, Brandon stood in the hallway speaking with a small group of senior staff. I heard him from 15 feet away. "We rely on our experts," he said, his voice carrying the careful weight of a disappointed leader. "Sometimes they let us down." Experts. He used the plural deliberately. But on that morning slide, under that glowing heading, there had been only one name. Mine. Not a team failure. Not a shared oversight. One analyst, bolded and scented, with every eye in the room directed precisely at him by a man who had planned the whole thing in advance. I sat at my desk and felt the walls close in from every side. I found out about the whisper campaign from Nina in finance. She pulled me aside near the elevator bank on a Tuesday afternoon, glancing once over her shoulder before she started talking, like she was making sure no one she recognized was watching from nearby. "I don't want to get involved in this," she said, keeping her voice low. "But I thought you should know what's being said." Brandon had been making his rounds. Not loudly, not in meetings or emails where any of it could be traced or referenced later. Inside conversations, in passing comments in corridors and break rooms, in the kind of carefully placed words that feel like personal opinions but spread through an office like facts that were always there. "Ethan struggles under pressure," he had been saying. And then, in a different conversation, in a different room, brilliant, but not leadership material. I thanked Nina and rode the elevator back up to my floor alone. He hadn't just blamed the project on me. He had gone further and done something more permanent. He was systematically planting doubt about who I was as a professional, not about a single decision or one specific mistake in one specific moment, but about my fundamental capacity to function at a high level under real conditions. This wasn't damage control. This was something else entirely. He was building a story in the minds of the people around me before anyone looked closely at the record. The failure wouldn't just follow me. It would define me. And by the time the audit began, the definition would already be settled. I walked back to my desk and tried to focus on my screen. I sat there for a long time before I typed a single word. That evening I got home later than usual. My wife Priya was in the kitchen when I came in, standing at the stove with her back to the door. She turned when she heard me come through and looked at my face the way she always did, with the particular, careful attention of someone who has spent years learning to read what a face is actually saying underneath whatever expression it's been arranged into. "Work okay?" she asked. "Fine," I said. She looked at me for exactly 1 second longer than necessary, then turned back to the stove without pushing it further. She had always known when to push and when to leave a space open. "We can't afford instability right now," she said quietly, almost to herself. Not with everything on the plate. I sat down at the kitchen table and nodded. What she meant was the house. We had signed the mortgage papers 4 months earlier. The numbers were tight and the payments were real, and every month required both of our incomes landing on time without interruption. We had run the math carefully before we signed, and the math only worked if nothing went seriously wrong. Brandon knew about the house. He had been the first person at the office to congratulate me when I mentioned it in passing. He had clapped me on the back in the hallway and said, "Big commitment. Good for you." He had smiled the whole time like he was genuinely pleased. Now I sat at the kitchen table in the house I had just bought, trying to calculate how afraid I should reasonably be. The answer kept coming back higher than I was comfortable with. He wasn't just threatening my job. He was threatening the thing my job existed to protect. I told Priya dinner smelled good. She smiled. I didn't sleep well that night. The HR meeting happened on a Thursday morning. I had been given almost no lead time, just a calendar invite that appeared the evening before, labeled Brief Alignment Check-in. I walked in to find Brandon already seated alongside a woman from Human Resources named Carla. A manila folder sat flat on the table between them. Both of them looked professionally calm. The document inside the folder was titled Leadership Alignment and Accountability Concerns. Carla explained in a measured voice that the meeting was a standard follow-up following a significant project event. Then Brandon picked up the thread and began to read directly from the document. He didn't look at me while he did it. He looked at the page, which somehow made it worse. Ethan tends to push back instead of own outcomes, he read. Push back. That was the term he chose for professionally documented disagreement. I had written an email flagging a specific risk. I had made a formal written recommendation before launch. In this document, that behavior was called pushback. He continued, he can be defensive when challenged. The words settled into the room like fine dust that coats every surface without making a sound. I noticed Carla was writing something in her notebook. The humiliation was quiet and entirely clinical. No shouting, no confrontation, no raised voices. Just a manager and an HR representative reading carefully selected language into the official record with the unhurried confidence of people who had prepared for this meeting in advance. This was not about accountability. This was about positioning. Every phrase in that document had been chosen to move the story in one direction, steadily, professionally, one sentence at a time, away from the man reading it and toward the man listening. I had one person I believed I could trust. Ryan sat 2 desks from mine and had been on the project team from the very beginning. He was sharp, observant, and had been present for everything that mattered. He knew the timeline. He had seen the emails. He understood exactly who had made which call and at what point in the process. I had always respected Ryan. He was the kind of coworker who kept his head down, told the truth when directly asked, and didn't involve himself in the kind of political maneuvering that wore other people down over time. After the HR meeting, I found him at his desk and asked quietly if we could speak privately. We walked together to an empty conference room, and I closed the door behind us. I pulled up the override email on my laptop, the one documenting that my approval authority had been removed 3 days before launch, and turned the screen toward him. Ryan read it carefully. He shook his head slowly when he finished. "That's not good for him," he said. I asked directly whether he would be willing to speak honestly if someone from leadership or the compliance review asked him what he had witnessed. "If they ask me," he said, "I'll tell them exactly what I saw." He said it with a steady, level look that carried the weight of a genuine promise. No hesitation, no careful qualifications, no visible discomfort. I felt something loosen slightly in my chest. Not relief exactly, but the small, important sensation of not being completely alone in something. I thanked him. He nodded. We walked back to our desks separately and said nothing more about it. I should have paid much closer attention to the word if. The audit announcement came on a Friday afternoon. An email went out from the compliance department, addressed to the full project team. External review, initiated per standard protocol. It explained that an independent compliance team would be conducting a formal review of the failed deployment, covering all related communications, system logs, and decision records from the relevant period. I read it 3 times sitting at my desk. The word external stood out more than anything else. Not an internal review managed by people who reported to the same chain of command that Brandon operated within. Outside eyes. People who had arrived with no prior stake in the outcome and no relationship to protect. Brandon appeared in the hallway not long after the email went around, making his usual easy rounds through the floor. He paused near a small cluster of team members and spoke with the relaxed confidence of a man who had nothing on his calendar that concerned him. "Good," he said, when someone mentioned the audit. "Transparency protects everyone." He glanced over and found my eyes across the space between us. He walked over without any change in his expression and placed a hand on my shoulder, exactly as he had done the day I told him about the house. "Especially you," he added. He smiled and moved on. I stood there and processed what had just happened. He had made it sound like reassurance, like concern, like he was looking out for me in the middle of a difficult situation. But the hand had pressed just slightly too firmly, and the word especially had carried something underneath it that was not warmth at all. It felt like a man pointing calmly at the exit before the door had even opened. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I wasn't entirely sure I believed that. The performance improvement plan arrived on a Monday. Carla set it on the table in front of me and smoothed it flat with her palm, the way you'd flatten a tablecloth before a meal. The document was several pages long and had a signature line at the bottom with my name printed underneath a blank space. "We'd like you to sign this," she said, "as a demonstration of accountability and your commitment to growth going forward." I picked it up and read the first page carefully, then the second. The language moved between very vague and very specific in a way that seemed deliberate. It referenced the project failure. It referenced the HR meeting. It referenced what it called a pattern of behaviors that created friction during high-pressure periods. I set it back down and looked at her directly. "What exactly am I being held accountable for?" I asked. Carla folded her hands on the table with the patience of someone who had answered versions of this question before. "Perception matters," she said. "In situations like this, demonstrating willingness to grow sends an important message to the organization. Perception, not facts, not a specific action with a specific consequence attached to it. The way things had looked, the impressions the situation had left in the minds of the people who witnessed it. I understood the structure of the trap immediately. If I signed the document, I was confessing, not to any particular thing, because the language was careful enough to avoid precision, but to a general failure of professional conduct. My signature would become evidence entirely disconnected from the truth and entirely connected to Brandon's version of events. If I refused to sign, I was difficult, resistant, uncooperative. I asked for time to review it carefully with my own judgment. Carla said, "Of course." The betrayal became a certainty on a Wednesday. I had been called back to HR for what Carla described as a continuation of the previous week's conversation. Brandon was not in the room. I sat down, and the meeting began in the usual professional tone, working through the same familiar language about development areas and organizational alignment. Then something shifted. Carla referenced a comment I had made privately. Not in a meeting, not in an email, not in any documented exchange that could be reasonably pulled from a project record. The exact words I had said to Ryan, alone in that empty conference room with the door closed between us and the rest of the floor, frustrated with Brandon's rushed decisions. One sentence, said quietly, said honestly, said to the one person I had believed it was safe to say it to. Now it was sitting inside an HR document. Beside it, attributed to Brandon's recent feedback. This emotional volatility concerns me. I sat completely still and let the word land. Volatility. One private sentence spoken in confidence to a colleague had been carried directly to management and translated, with careful precision, into evidence of emotional instability. Ryan had not waited to be asked. He had volunteered. I thought about his steady look across the table in that conference room. The no hesitation. The if they ask me, I'll tell them what I saw. He had told them something. It just wasn't what I had been counting on. I kept my expression neutral for the rest of the meeting. I confirmed only what was already in the written record. When I left the building that evening, I sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time before I turned the key. I needed to be careful, and I needed to stop trusting the wrong people. I spent that weekend building a file, not out of anger, and not with any plan to fight anyone publicly. I had learned early enough in my working life that arguments lose and documents win, and I was not going to walk into another room the way I had walked into the last several, without something concrete in my hands. I opened my laptop on the kitchen table Saturday morning while Priya was out, and I worked through the afternoon and into the evening. I pulled every relevant email thread and organized them in strict chronological order, starting from the first risk flag I had raised and ending with the access denied message I had received from the deployment system 3 days before launch. I gathered the Slack messages, not the single cropped screenshot Brandon had displayed on the conference room screen, but the full thread with all timestamps and all context intact. I compiled the deployment access logs showing the precise moment my authorization had been removed and whose credentials had initiated the change. I wrote a clean, simple timeline of the entire period in plain language. No editorializing, no emotional commentary, no demands, just dates, actions, and sequence, the record as it actually existed. On Monday morning, I walked back into the continuation of the HR meeting that had been scheduled. I set my folder on the table and opened it. I'd like to walk through the documented sequence of events, I said. Then I started talking. Carla stopped interrupting me after the third email. By the 6th, she had put her pen down entirely. She was no longer writing anything in her notebook. She was reading what was in front of her. That was the moment I understood they had not expected this. They had expected me to either sign or argue. I had done neither. The isolation started quietly, the way most of Brandon's moves started quietly. The first thing I noticed was my calendar. For the previous 2 years, my mornings had been packed with project reviews, client preparation meetings, and risk analysis sessions where real decisions were made. I was generally one of a small group of people in a room that mattered. That week, my calendar filled up with a different kind of work. Filing updates, report formatting, status summaries for projects I had no real involvement in and no meaningful context for. Careful, deliberate, low-stakes work. Then Brandon made an announcement to the full team during our Thursday morning stand-up. He used the warm, upbeat tone he always used when delivering news he had already fully decided. Ethan's going to be focusing on some development areas for the next little while, he said. We want to make sure he has the space he needs to grow. He smiled when he said it. Several people nodded along without visible discomfort. Translation, which every person in that room understood without any difficulty. He failed. His being sidelined. Don't attach yourself too closely to him right now. I watched the shift happen while I was standing there. Coworkers who had grabbed lunch with me a month earlier found reasons to be busy when I walked past. Eye contact became brief and carefully avoidant. The conversations that used to find me naturally now curved around my desk the way a stream curves around a rock. He was erasing me in full view of everyone. Not firing me. Not formally disciplining me in any way that created a paper record. Just making me invisible, and waiting patiently for invisible to become comfortable enough for me to vanish on my own terms. I was not going to vanish. The external auditor's name was Patricia Welsh. She was businesslike in a way that felt entirely genuine rather than performed. She carried a notepad she actually wrote in, wore reading glasses low on her nose, and asked questions the way a careful surgeon works, clean, targeted, and placed exactly where they needed to go. She didn't waste time, and she didn't use extra words. She interviewed me alone in a small conference room on the 4th floor that I had never used before. She had a stack of printed documents in front of her. I recognized several of them from a distance. She looked directly at me. Did you recommend a delay before the deployment took place? She asked. Yes, I said. In writing. Yes. I opened my folder and placed the risk email in front of her. She read it from the beginning to the end, moving her fingers slowly along each line. She didn't react visibly in any way. No widening of the eyes, no nod, no audible response. She simply read it all the way through, set it down, and made a note on her pad. Then she said, I'd like to request the raw system access logs directly from the IT department. She wrote something else down. I looked toward the glass wall of the conference room. Brandon was standing in the hallway on the other side, speaking to someone, but he was not looking at the person he was talking to. He was looking at the conference room, at Patricia, at the notepad in her hand. His jaw tightened in a way that most people would not have noticed. I noticed. For the first time since the morning my name had appeared on that slide, the weight in my chest shifted just slightly. Not gone, but different. For 3 days after Patricia's interviews began, it appeared that nothing had changed at all. Brandon still ran the Monday morning meetings. He still used the same steady, confident tone he always used. The one that made complicated things sound simple and his own decisions sound like the only reasonable conclusion anyone could have reached. He still moved through the office with his usual ease, pausing at desks, laughing at the right moments, carrying himself like a man whose schedule contained nothing that concerned him. At a leadership check-in on Tuesday, someone brought up the audit as a potential concern. Brandon gestured it away without hesitation. Audits always nitpick, he said. That's literally their function. This will pass without issue. People nodded around the table. A few smiled. The conversation moved on to something else within 30 seconds. I sat across from him and watched it happen and felt a familiar, cold kind of doubt begin to move back in. Maybe he was right. Maybe the review would run its full course and produce the kind of report that used language like process improvements encouraged and communication protocols to be enhanced. Careful language that sounds significant in a summary and changes almost nothing on the ground. Maybe the documentation I had organized meant less than I thought. Maybe the override email and the access logs and the full conversation thread would get quietly absorbed into a finding that concluded no single individual bore clear responsibility. Maybe a man like Brandon, 5 years in this role, trusted by 3 vice presidents, fluent in every language that organizations use to protect their own, was simply untouchable. I went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table and I wasn't certain of anything. Priya brought me tea without being asked. She didn't say anything. Sometimes that is exactly the right thing. The audit had been running for 9 days when everything shifted. I heard about it secondhand, through a comment from someone in the IT department. Not office gossip exactly, but a detail too specific and too particular to dismiss. Patricia's team had gone back into the system and requested the full dashboard data from the final 2 weeks before the deployment. They weren't just reviewing communications anymore. They were examining the numbers. What they discovered, based on what eventually came out through channels I had no part in, was that the metrics dashboard had been altered. The changes were not immediately visible. No data had been deleted outright. The flagged volatility fields, the same indicators I had specifically cited in my written risk recommendation, had not been removed from the system. They had been reclassified in a way that caused them to be excluded from the summary view that senior leadership reviewed each week before making decisions. The modification timestamp was attached to one specific set of login credentials. Brandon's. The language that appeared in alien tonal memos used the word oversight, as in an unintentional oversight in how dashboard data was filtered for executive review. As in, the configuration may not have reflected the complete data picture available in the system. Measured, careful, professional language. Nobody used the word misleading in writing yet. Nobody said intentional out loud. But the gap between what leadership had seen on that dashboard and what the full underlying data actually showed was not a small rounding error. It was substantial, and it had been created by a specific set of hands, at a specific hour, using a specific login. I heard about this and sat very still at my desk for a long moment. The word oversight was not going to hold forever under that kind of scrutiny. The meeting invitation appeared in my calendar on a Thursday afternoon with almost no lead time. The subject line read, Mandatory Project Review, Executive Session. The attendee list was longer and more senior than anything I had attended in 3 years at this company. Arthur Cole, the CFO, was listed at the top. The head of compliance, Patricia Welsh, and a colleague from the external review team. 2 senior vice presidents, the head of legal, and at the bottom, almost as an afterthought in the formatting, my name. I read the list slowly from top to bottom. Then I looked around the office to see if anyone else near me had received the same calendar notification. A few people close to the executive corridor were speaking in voices too low to hear from where I sat today. One of the VPs I recognized walked past my desk without her usual brief acknowledgement. She was looking at her phone and moving with purpose. I texted Priya, late tonight. Big meeting. She replied in 30 seconds, "Eat something first." I sat at my desk for the next 2 hours and worked through what was in front of me. I answered emails. I reviewed a document. I kept my face neutral and my movements unhurried. From the outside, I looked like someone having a normal Thursday afternoon. But inside, I was moving through the file I had built one more time. The emails in chronological order. The access logs. The full conversation thread. The timeline assembled on that long Saturday at the kitchen table. I had not gone looking for a confrontation. I had not tried to build a case against anyone. I had simply written down what actually happened, in the order it actually happened, without adding anything that wasn't already there. Now it was time to find out what that record was worth. Carla from HR stopped me in the hallway Thursday morning before the executive session. She looked the way people look when they're delivering a message they did not write themselves, slightly uncomfortable, moving with purpose but without enthusiasm. She asked if I had a moment. We stepped into her office and she closed the door. "I want to make sure you're prepared," she said carefully, "for the fact that depending on the findings from today's session, there may be decisions made about the structure of the team going forward." She paused, "including separation, in some cases." Separation, the precise corporate term for being let go. I nodded once and said I understood. That evening, I stayed at the office after the floor cleared. The hallways were dim and the sound of the building settled into quiet. I organized my desk without any drama, not clearing it out, just making sure things were where they should be. I made copies of my personal documents and sent them to my private email address. I looked at the small framed photo near my monitor, Priya and me at the coast last summer, both of us slightly windblown and clearly happy, and I left it exactly where it was. On the drive home, I told Priya calmly that the next day might carry difficult news. I said it without dressing it up because she never wanted things dressed up. "Whatever happens," she said, "we'll figure it out together." I nodded. As I had been leaving the building, Brandon had passed me in the corridor with his jacket over one arm and his usual unhurried walk. He had glanced my way and said, almost pleasantly, "See, escalations create stress for everyone." I hadn't responded. I just walked to my car and started the engine. The executive session began at 8 in the morning in the large conference room on the top floor. This room was reserved for board presentations and major contract signings. Everything in it was intentional. The long table, the height of the chairs, the way the city spread out through the windows behind the screen. Patricia Welsh sat at one end with her colleague and a laptop open in front of her. Arthur Cole sat near the center. Legal was present on one side, compliance on the other. Brandon sat 3 chairs to my left. Relaxed in the way he was always relaxed in rooms like this. Hands flat on the table, expression arranged into something that looked very much like confidence. Patricia opened the session by explaining she wanted to revisit specific communications from the project record. She connected her laptop to the projector. The first thing that appeared on the screen was the Slack message Brandon had used against me in the postmortem meeting. "This shouldn't be a problem." My words, projected again in that same building, in front of several of the same faces that had been in the room the first time. I felt the same tight pressure in my chest that I had felt when I first saw it appear on a screen with my name above it. Then Patricia scrolled up, directly above my message, in the exact same Slack thread from the same conversation, was an earlier message I had sent, a clear, explicit warning about the volatility risk in the deployment window. The full context, the part that had been deliberately left out of the first presentation. The room changed. I felt it more than I saw it. The VP who had chuckled in that first meeting sat up slightly straighter. He did not make any sound. Patricia said nothing. She left the screen exactly where it was and let it speak for itself. Patricia let the slide remain on the screen for a long moment before she moved to the next one. Then she looked around the table at the people gathered there and asked her next question. She asked it evenly and without any emphasis, as if it was simply a factual matter that needed confirming for the record. According to the project communications and the system logs, who authorized the override against the documented risk recommendation? Brandon spoke before anyone else could. His voice was measured and controlled. It was a collaborative decision, he said. The team was aligned on urgency, and we moved forward together with that shared understanding. Patricia made a note on her pad. Then she turned toward the IT representative who had been brought into the session as part of the technical review, a quiet man named Clarence who I had spoken to only a handful of times over my years at the company. "Can you walk us through what the deployment logs show regarding authorization?" she said. Clarence opened his laptop and shared his screen with the projector. Lines of system data appeared, dense and precise. He navigated to a specific entry and highlighted it carefully. "Single credential authorization," he said. "One login used. One action taken." He did not add anything. He did not interpret or editorialize. He simply stated what the data contained and left it there. The room went quiet in a way that had real texture to it. Not the polite quiet of a meeting where people are being professionally careful. The kind of quiet that settles over a group of people when they have just absorbed something they cannot immediately explain away or redirect. I looked at Brandon. He was looking at the screen. His hands were still flat on the table, but the space between his fingers had shifted. They were pressing down just slightly harder than before. Arthur Cole leaned forward. He had said very little up to that point in the session. He had been watching and listening with the specific, focused attention of someone who is counting things while other people do the talking. Now he put both forearms on the table and directed his attention at the data on the projector screen. "Walk me through the timestamp," he said to Clarence. Clarence navigated to the relevant log entry and read the time aloud. 11:42 p.m. The deployment override had been initiated at 11:42 in the evening, 3 days before the scheduled launch window. Not during a team discussion. Not in a collaborative working session with multiple people present. Late at night. Single credentials. One person taking one action in a system that should have required a documented chain of approval for a change of that kind. Arthur Cole turned toward Brandon. He spoke quietly and with complete precision. "Why was the risk formally acknowledged in the written record?" he said, "but not escalated upward to senior leadership before this action was taken?" Brandon shifted in his chair. "Just slightly. We didn't believe it met the threshold," he said. "We were operating under significant time pressure. The urgency was real and the deadline was real." Arthur Cole nodded once, slowly. "A six-figure financial exposure qualifies as material by any standard this organization operates under," he said. He wasn't asking a question. He was establishing a fact and placing it on the record. Brandon tried to find another angle. He reached for the broader context, the client relationship, the competitive timeline, the nature of judgment calls in fast-moving projects. He spoke for about 90 seconds. No one at the table followed him anywhere he tried to go. Patricia Welsh spoke next, and what she said changed the direction of the entire room in a single paragraph. She pulled up a specific section of her written findings on the projector and read directly from it. Her voice was deliberate and unhurried, the way someone reads language they know will be referenced in other rooms and other conversations for a long time afterward. "The documented objection filed prior to deployment has direct bearing on the company's liability exposure under the client contract," she said. "In the absence of any written objection on record, the organization's position under the applicable penalty clause will be materially weaker and potentially indefensible." She looked up from the page. The existence of that documented risk recommendation protects the company. Without it, financial liability increases substantially and the company's ability to demonstrate due diligence is severely limited. Arthur Cole turned and looked at me directly. Not at the screen, not at his notes, not at Brandon or Patricia or anyone else at the table. Directly at me. "You documented this," he said. "Yes," I said. 2 sentences. 4 words between us. Simple and quiet and completely unhurried. But the weight of those 4 words filled the room in a way I had not expected. Something changed in how the people around that table were looking at me. I could feel it without being able to point to any one face or any one expression. I had spent 2 weeks as the name on the slide. The analyst who had let the team down. The person being quietly sidelined and carefully erased from any room where decisions were made. Now I was something entirely different. I was the record that had kept the company from a far worse outcome than the one they were already managing. Arthur Cole was not finished. He set down the document in front of him and looked at Brandon with the calm, direct focus of a person who has already reached a conclusion and is working through the final necessary steps. Did you knowingly bypass the risk escalation protocol that exists for deployments of this classification? He asked. Brandon's composure cracked in a very small and very specific way. Not dramatically, not in the way composure breaks in films, with raised voices or visible anger. Just a slight, almost imperceptible shift in his breathing and a momentary failure in his eyes to hold the steadiness they had maintained through the entire session. We were aligned on urgency, he said. The identical words from 15 minutes earlier, said with the same careful tone, but landing in an entirely different way in a room that now held an entirely different set of established facts. Patricia responded without looking up from her notepad. The documentation in the project record indicates a clear and specific objection was raised in writing and then overridden, she said evenly. The term alignment does not accurately characterize what the record shows. Brandon tried to find another direction. He spoke about team dynamics and delivery pressures and the kinds of real-world judgment calls that fast-moving projects demanded from their managers. He kept his voice steady and his posture professional. No one interrupted him, but no one followed him either. The room had already reached its own conclusion before he finished his last sentence. I could see it in the stillness of the people around the table. The way no one was writing anything down. The way Arthur Cole was simply watching Brandon finish speaking with the patient expression of a man who already knows exactly what comes next. The meeting ended with very little ceremony. Arthur Cole thanked Patricia and her colleague for their work. He thanked the representatives from legal and compliance. He said there would be formal follow-up communications and that the full findings would be shared with all relevant parties in writing within the next several business days. He spoke in the composed, measured tone of someone who has navigated difficult situations before and understands that the room needs to close cleanly. People gathered their materials. Voices dropped to quiet murmurs. I collected my folder from the table, stood, and walked out without looking in Brandon's direction. In the hallway, I found a quiet corner near the water station and stood for a moment with my back to the wall. I breathed slowly. My hands were completely steady. Steadier, actually, than they had been on the drive-in that morning. The tightness that had been sitting in my chest every morning for 2 weeks felt different. Not gone, but loosened somehow, like a knot that had finally been worked through. I went back to my desk and opened my email. About 20 minutes later, I noticed quiet movement near the executive corridor at the far end of the floor. No raised voices, no visible confrontation. Just 2 men from building security walking with calm, unhurried purpose toward Brandon's office. A few minutes after that, the small indicator near the main security panel changed in a way that anyone watching would recognize. His access had been deactivated. He never reached his desk. Whatever he had planned to do next, whoever he had planned to call, none of it happened. He was walked out through the side corridor, and that was the last time I saw him in that building. No announcement, no dramatic moment, just quiet. The written findings from the external audit came back exactly 2 weeks after the morning my name had been bolded on that slide. Patricia Welsh's team delivered the formal report simultaneously to HR, legal, and the executive team. A summary was distributed to project staff. I read it at my desk on a Thursday morning, with a cup of coffee that was warm this time, in a building that felt noticeably different from the one I had been sitting in 14 days earlier. The language in the report was formal and precise in the way that official compliance documents are precise, written to close off interpretation and leave no space for spin. Under the section titled Analyst Conduct, risk recommendation was appropriately documented and submitted prior to deployment. All established protocols were followed. Under decision authority, override decision was made unilaterally at the management level outside of established risk escalation procedures. Under reporting integrity, dashboard configuration was altered in a manner that reduced visibility of flagged risk indicators for senior leadership review. This was inconsistent with the organization's transparency standards. And then, in a section I read through 3 full times to be certain I was understanding it correctly, analysts' conduct throughout the project period reflected appropriate professional diligence. No accountability findings are attributed to this role. My name was in that document. Not bolded this time. Not on a slide in a room full of people watching to see how I would react. In a formal compliance report, in black and white, explicitly and completely cleared. I set the coffee down and looked out the window for a long moment. 2 weeks. 2 weeks of everything that had happened. And in the end, the record had simply told the truth. The first person to stop by my desk afterward was the VP who had laughed. His name was Daniel Osei, and he was tall and confident and wore suits that fit the way suits fit people who have been wearing them for decades. He appeared beside my desk 2 days after the audit report was distributed, holding a coffee mug loosely and wearing an expression that had been arranged into something between professional warmth and careful neutrality. "Tough situation," he said. He paused for a moment. "You handled it well." I looked at him. Handled it well. That was the phrase he had chosen. Not, "I should have looked more carefully at the original thread before I laughed." Not, "We failed to read the situation clearly." Not even a direct acknowledgement that he had been present in the room the morning my name appeared on a slide designed to destroy my professional reputation in front of every colleague I had. Just, "You handled it well." "Thank you, Daniel," I said. He nodded and walked away. I turned back to my screen and sat with that for a moment. This, I understood, was what organizational redemption actually looked like. Not apologies from the people who watched it happen and said nothing. Not accountability from the ones who chuckled or nodded at the right moments during Brandon's presentation. Just a brief, carefully measured acknowledgement that I had gotten through it without making things worse for anyone else in the room. I had survived cleanly. I hadn't made a scene. I hadn't filed anything publicly. That, apparently, was the version of events everyone could most easily move forward from. I made my peace with it, not because it was enough, because the record existed, and it was not going anywhere. Arthur Cole called me into his office on a Monday. He had a clean desk and a wide window that looked out over the street below. He did not gesture for me to sit when I came through the door. He was finishing something he was reading, and he completed it before he looked up. I noticed that and respected it. It said something about how he operated. "Sit down, Ethan," he said. I sat today. "You protected this company," he said, at a moment when the people who had more authority and more resources than you were not doing their jobs. He let that sit between us for a moment. "I've been working in organizations for a long time," he continued. "I've seen a version of this situation more times than I'd like to count. What I almost never see is someone who documents their concerns professionally, maintains their composure under sustained pressure, and doesn't blow the whole thing apart emotionally when they are being pushed from every direction." He opened the folder on his desk and slid a single page across the table toward me. The page described a new position, Interim Risk Operations Lead. The reporting line ran directly to the office of the CFO, not to a department manager, not to any of the vice presidents who had been in that conference room on either of those mornings. Directly to Arthur Cole. I read the page carefully from top to bottom. "This is a real role," he said, "with real authority and a real seat at the table before problems become disasters rather than after." I looked up at him. "When do you need an answer?" I asked. "Now works," he said. I told him yes. 3 weeks after my new role was formalized, I was scheduled to present to the board. Not as a supporting voice in someone else's presentation. Not as the analyst providing data while a manager delivered the conclusions. A full governance presentation, new risk escalation controls, override transparency requirements, immutable system logging standards. A framework designed to make sure that what had happened to this project could not repeat itself in the same structure, not by any manager at any level, regardless of how much confidence they projected or how much authority they had accumulated. I prepared for 4 full days. I didn't use dramatic language. I didn't reference the specific events that had created the need for these changes. The board didn't need the story. They needed the solution, presented clearly by the person who understood it most completely. I walked into the boardroom on a Tuesday morning. The table was long and the chairs were full. Arthur Cole was at one end. 3 independent board members I was meeting for the first time. 2 senior vice presidents I recognized from previous sessions. Legal and compliance positioned along the side wall. I stood at the head of the table. I walked through the escalation thresholds, clear, tiered, documented at every level. I presented the override transparency rules. Every manual override would automatically generate a notification to 2 reporting levels above the initiating manager. I showed the immutable logging standards, No data field could be reclassified without generating a complete and permanent audit trail. I spoke clearly. I answered every question that came up without hesitation. I did not rush through anything. When I finished, Arthur Cole looked around the room. The board approved unanimously. Not one person interrupted me during the entire presentation. I thanked them, gathered my materials, and walked back to my office. The text came in on a Friday afternoon, about 6 weeks after Brandon had been escorted from the building. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a risk summary, the kind of work I had been brought in to lead, when my phone buzzed on the corner of the desk. I picked it up and read the message. Ethan, I hope there are no hard feelings about how everything played out. I've had some conversations with a few firms, and one of them has asked for references from previous leadership. Would you be willing to provide one for me? I set the phone down and looked out the window for a moment. The street below was moving with the familiar rhythm of a Friday afternoon. People leaving a little early, cars finding their way through intersections. The particular, loose energy of a week about to release into a weekend. Ordinary, indifferent, going on the way it always did. I thought about the morning my name had been bolded on that slide. I thought about the door closing in the empty office and the controlled, careful pressure of a man who had planned every word in advance. I thought about the Slack message stripped of its context and projected in front of everyone I worked with. I thought about the performance improvement plan and the word volatility and Ryan's steady, unhesitating look that had turned out to mean something entirely different from what I had believed. I picked up the phone and typed my response. I can confirm your dates of employment. I sent it and put the phone back on the corner of my desk. He did not reply. I had not expected him to. There was nothing useful to say to that, and we both understood it without either of us having to spell it out. 6 months after the morning everything changed. I walked into the office on a Tuesday and found a printed memo waiting on my desk. It was from the Compliance Committee, co-signed by Arthur Cole and the board chair. The subject line read, Risk Governance Framework, Official Policy Adoption. The protocol I had designed was now permanent company policy, embedded into the governance structure and applicable to every project above a defined risk threshold going forward. Documented escalation review required at every relevant decision point. Override actions generating automatic, multi-level notification. Dashboard submissions to senior leadership verified against raw source data before distribution. My name appeared in the memo as the framework's architect, which was simply an accurate description of what had happened. That same week, Ryan stopped me near the coffee machine on Thursday morning and asked, with his usual easy manner, whether I wanted to grab lunch sometime soon. I told him I was pretty slammed with the current workload. I said it without any particular edge in my voice and without any explanation attached. Some things don't need to be argued. They just need to be understood between the people involved. What I learned across those 2 months, tested in a way that theory never tests anything, was something I thought I already knew but had not fully believed until it was the only thing standing between me and a story someone else had written about who I was. Public humiliation feels powerful in the moment. A name on a slide, a room full of people watching, a VP chuckling. It feels like the end of something. But documentation is more powerful than humiliation. Always. A name on a slide disappears when the room empties. A timestamp in a system log does not go anywhere. Brandon tried to end my career in a single meeting. It took one audit to end his, and I never raised my voice once.